I thought I was rebuilding my life, finding peace, healing from the mess Greg left behind. But instead, I let weakness in. I let Cole, my stepson, cross lines I should have protected. I betrayed trust, morality, myself. And for what? A moment of comfort? Desire? I discussed myself. Every glance, every touch, what felt intimate was actually a slow, deliberate unraveling of everything I once stood for. I was supposed to protect him, not become the reason he needs saving. The house had been quiet for weeks, peaceful. In the way loneliness sometimes is when you learn to live inside it. I'd gotten used to the soft rituals, tea in the evenings, folded blankets no one used, silence that didn't ask anything of me. Then Cole moved back in. He said it was temporary, just until he figured things out. I told him he was welcome, of course, but the moment he stepped through the door, the air shifted. He wasn't the boy I remembered. His voice had settled into something deeper, his shoulders broader. He carried himself differently, like he no longer needed permission to take up space. I watched him without meaning to. The way he dropped his bag at the door. The way his eyes lingered on mine just a second too long. We didn't talk much at first. He kept to himself, respectful, quiet, but there was something underneath it, something unsaid that I felt every time he walked into a room. The stillness I'd grown used to wasn't still anymore. It trembled, hummed, every night, as I lay in bed listening to the soft rhythm of his footsteps down the hall. I wondered if he felt it too. The first few days passed in a blur of polite distance. Cole was respectful, quiet, careful. He offered to help around the house, fixing the dripping tap I'd learned to ignore, carrying in groceries, wiping down the counter after dinner without being asked. It should have been comforting. It wasn't. It was unnerving, because every time he leaned close, reaching past me for a dish, brushing against my shoulder in the hallway, something inside me caught fire. Subtle, slow, dangerous. He didn't say much, but I felt his eyes on me. In the mornings, when I padded into the kitchen in my robe. At night, when I curled up on the couch with a glass of wine. His gaze lingered too long sometimes, then darted away as if afraid of being caught. But I noticed. And worse, I liked it. One evening, I was washing up after dinner. Sleeves rolled, wrists damp with soapy water. Cole stood nearby, drying the dishes. It was quiet, only the soft clink of ceramic and the hum of late summer air through the open window. "You always did keep this place calm," he said, his voice low, like he wasn't sure if he should have said it aloud. I glanced at him, unsure how to read the warmth in his tone. "It's not always calm," I replied, "just quieter when no one's asking for anything." He paused. "I'm not trying to take anything from you." I turned, surprised by the seriousness in his voice. He was standing closer than I realized. The counter between us suddenly felt like a suggestion, not a boundary. "I know," I said, quietly. "It's just different with you here." He nodded slowly. "Different good?" I swallowed hard. My throat felt tight. "I don't know yet." His eyes held mine, something unreadable stirring in them. Then, he broke the gaze first, looking down, setting the plate aside, his fingers brushing mine just slightly. That touch, barely anything, skin on skin for less than a second, sent a ripple through me. I pulled back too quickly, dropping the dish towel. It fluttered to the floor. "Sorry," I whispered. I didn't know why I said it. He didn't bend to pick it up. Neither did I. We just stood there, caught in the quiet. His voice broke it. "You don't have to be afraid of me." I looked up. His expression was soft, not demanding, not arrogant, just honest. "I'm not afraid of you," I replied. I was afraid of myself. Afraid of how easily I imagined his fingers on my waist instead of a towel. Of how many nights I'd spent pretending the sound of his footsteps didn't comfort me more than it should. Cole took a step back then, like he'd sensed the crack in me widening. "I'm gonna turn in," he said gently. I nodded. But when he left the room, the air still held his heat. And I stood there, heart pounding, wondering how long we could keep pretending we didn't feel it too. I tried to keep the evening ordinary. I lit a candle in the living room, turned on something soft from my playlist, and curled up with a blanket, pretending I wasn't listening for his footsteps. I told myself it was harmless, just the familiar hum of someone else in the house. But that wasn't true, and I knew it. when Cole came in from his room, barefoot and shirtless, a towel draped around his neck. I didn't breathe for a moment. He moved with quiet confidence now, still calm, still respectful, but not oblivious. He caught me looking, and for the first time, he didn't look away. "You always keep it so warm in here," he said, settling into the armchair across from me. His voice low, soft edge. "I like warmth," I replied, forcing a smile, but my fingers tugged at the edge of the blanket without meaning to. He leaned back, legs stretched out, one arm slung over the side of the chair. "It smells like you." I blinked. "What?" He gave a half smile. "The room, your candle, the blanket. It smells like you." I didn't respond. I couldn't. My skin prickled beneath my robe. A long silence settled between us, filled only by the faint music playing from my phone. "You're different lately," he said, watching me. "Since I came back." "You think so?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Cole nodded slowly. "You don't hide as well." That pierced. Not because it was cruel, but because it was true. I set my mug down, heart beating too fast. "What am I not hiding?" "Cole?" He stood, crossing the room, then paused beside the couch. The air around us thickened. He wasn't touching me, but I felt him, the heat of him, the way his presence pressed into my awareness like a weight on my chest. "You look at me like you want to say something," he murmured, and every time I try to ask, you disappear behind polite small talk. My mouth went dry. "I don't want to make things worse for you," he added, softer now, "but I need to know if I'm imagining it." He wasn't, and we both knew it. I sat up a little straighter, the blanket sliding off one shoulder. He noticed. His breath hitched. "You're not imagining it," I whispered, the words trembling on my tongue. "But that doesn't mean we can act on it." He stared at me for a moment, eyes dark, voice quiet. "Then tell me to go." I didn't. I couldn't. Instead, I reached for his hand. My fingers curled around his like it was the most natural thing in the world. Like we'd done this 100 times. He sank onto the edge of the couch beside me. Our hands still joined, nothing else touching, but it felt like everything in me leaned toward him. We sat like that for what felt like forever. Close, quiet, suspended in something neither of us could undo. And I knew then, it had already begun. It was late, well past midnight, and I was restless again. The apartment was dark except for a faint sliver of hallway light spilling from under the bathroom door. I moved toward it barefoot, quietly, thinking he must have finished. I didn't knock. I never used to need to. I pushed the door open, already reaching for the light, and froze. Cole was there, standing at the sink, towel slung low on his hips, back bare and glistening slightly from the heat. He'd just stepped out of the shower, steam still curling in the air around him. For a split second, we both froze, his eyes catching mine in the mirror. Wide and stunned, his chest rose sharply, muscles tensing under his skin. My mouth opened, but no sound came out. He turned, slow and awkward, gripping the towel instinctively. I thought you were asleep." I should have turned away. I should have laughed it off, shut the door and left him his privacy. But I didn't move. I couldn't. Because something inside me had snapped loose the moment I saw him, this grown man with broad shoulders, strong lines, and a quiet vulnerability that struck me harder than anything else. This wasn't the boy I remembered, and that realization was terrifying. "I'm sorry," I finally managed, stepping back, eyes lowering too late. "I didn't mean to." "It's okay," he said quickly, his voice cracked slightly, not from fear, but something else. The moment hung between us, breathless, heavy, impossible. I turned and left the bathroom, shutting the door behind me with a trembling hand. But even with it closed, I could still feel the image seared into my memory. The curve of his shoulders, the way his body looked like it had been built slowly, carefully, like he'd grown into something no one had noticed until now. Back in my room, I sat on the edge of the bed, heart racing. What scared me most wasn't that I saw him. It was that I felt something. Something warm, and raw, and deeply forbidden. A part of me wanted to justify it, say it was just surprise, shock, that my body reacted before my mind could. But I knew the truth. It wasn't just instinct, it was awareness. Minutes passed, maybe more, then a soft knock at my door. I froze. Are you okay? Cole's voice, gentle, careful. I took a breath, steadied myself. Yeah, I said, I just didn't expect you to be there. I didn't expect you to stay. I opened the door slowly. He was still damp, wearing only a thin t-shirt and sweatpants now. His hair was messy, his face flushed, and yet, his eyes held mine, direct. Vulnerable, but unafraid. I won't tell anyone, he said quietly, if that's what you're worried about. My chest tightened. It's not that. Then what is it? I didn't have an answer. Not one I could say out loud. So I just nodded, and he stepped back, giving me space. But the space between us had already changed. And we both knew it. The next morning, the air in the apartment felt charged. Not tense. Exactly. Just aware. Every move, every glance, carried a weight it hadn't before. I kept myself busy, straightening cushions, refilling the kettle, wiping a counter that was already clean. Anything to avoid thinking about the way Cole had looked in that bathroom mirror. The way my body had reacted without permission. He emerged from his room just after 9, wearing sweatpants and a fitted black tee. Hair damp again, barefoot. Morning, he said softly, like he was testing my mood. Morning, I replied, not looking up from the stove. I could feel his eyes on me, lingering at the curve of my shoulder, the exposed sliver of skin between my tank top and pajama pants. I told myself I was imagining it, that I wanted to be imagining it. He stepped beside me, reaching for 2 mugs from the shelf above the sink. His chest brushed my back, barely. But enough. My breath caught. Sorry, he murmured, his voice low, close to my ear. It's okay, I said quickly, too quickly. He didn't move away. Instead, he stood there a moment longer than necessary, then set the mugs down and leaned on the counter beside me. Arms folded, watching the coffee drip into the pot. You've been quiet, he said after a pause. I hesitated. So have you. He looked down, a slight smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Guess I don't know how to talk about last night. My stomach flipped. There's nothing to talk about. I lied. He looked at me then. Really looked. But we both are talking about it. Just not out loud. The coffee pot beeped, startling me. I busied myself pouring 2 cups. It gave me something to do with my hands. Something to hide the tremble in my fingers. He took his mug, then nodded toward the couch. Sit with me? I hesitated, then followed. We settled at opposite ends. But even with the full couch between us, I felt him. The quiet tension stretched like a thread between our bodies. I'm not trying to make things weird, he said gently, but I think they already are. I met his eyes. You didn't do anything wrong. Cole. I walked in. I stayed. That's on me. He shook his head. No, it's not about wrong or right. It's about what's real. The honesty in his voice shook me. I've thought about you, he added quietly, even when I shouldn't. I closed my eyes, heart pounding. Don't say that. Why? Because I've thought about you too. The words escaped before I could stop them. We sat in silence, hearts racing, breathing unsteady. No one moved, no one touched. But the couch between us had already disappeared. And for the first time, neither of us wanted it back. We didn't speak for a long time after that. He sat at one end of the couch, quiet, contemplative. I sat at the other, holding my coffee cup like it could somehow ground me. The confession hung in the air between us, thick and breathless. Neither of us took it back. I could feel his gaze, just as I had for days now, weeks. If I was honest. But this time, I didn't pretend not to notice. Do you think we're crazy? I asked quietly, my voice nearly lost in the hum of the refrigerator. No, Cole said without hesitation. I think we're lonely. The truth of that struck hard. We were lonely, each of us carrying years of hurt, abandonment, and silence. Both of us starved for something we couldn't name out loud. He stood slowly, setting his mug down on the coffee table. Then he walked toward me, not with urgency, but with a kind of quiet purpose. When he reached me, he didn't sit. He just looked down at me, eyes soft but full of something deeper. Need, longing, maybe even fear. Can I? He asked. Voice low. I nodded. He sat beside me, closer than before. Our knees touched. I didn't pull away. His hand brushed mine, lightly, testing. I turned my palm toward his, letting our fingers meet, then fold together like they'd always meant to. That one simple contact made my breath catch. When I looked at him, his expression had changed. He wasn't uncertain anymore. He leaned in, slowly, watching me the whole way. I didn't move, didn't flinch. My eyes fluttered shut the moment his lips touched mine, soft and careful. Like he was asking the question again with his mouth. And I answered. The kiss deepened, not frantic or rushed, but searching. His hand slid to my cheek. Warm and firm. I leaned into him, letting the pressure of his body ease something that had been wound tight inside me for so long. We broke apart. Barely. I've wanted to do that for a long time. He whispered. I swallowed. So have I. He pulled me gently into his arms. My head found his shoulder. I curled into his chest like I'd done with people I'd loved in the past, but never like this. Never with this trembling sense that the world was tilting and finally making sense in the same breath. I felt safe, wanted, terrified. His hand moved up and down my back in slow, reassuring strokes. I don't know what this means, I whispered. Neither do I, he murmured into my hair. But I'm here. And for now, that was enough. No more pretending, no more running, just the two of us, caught in the fragile, forbidden space where honesty finally met desire, and neither of us could turn away. The morning light was pale and cold when I opened my eyes. I was alone in the bed. The sheets still held his warmth. For a moment, I lay there in silence, staring at the ceiling, trying to piece together what had shifted inside me. My body felt weightless and heavy all at once. The taste of him still lingered on my lips. The memory of his touch pressed into my skin. It wasn't just what we had done, it was how it had felt. Slow, real, irrevocable. When I sat up, my robe hanging open, I didn't rush to cover myself. I wasn't ashamed, I was changed. The question now wasn't whether it happened, it was what came next. I found him in the kitchen, standing by the sink in a white t-shirt and loose flannel pants. The morning light lit up the side of his face. He looked like himself, but softer, and somehow, older. He turned as I entered. Hey, he said, his voice quiet. Hey, I replied. I didn't look away. Neither did he. There was a beat of silence before I said it. We need to talk. He nodded, setting his coffee down. I know. I moved to the counter, placing myself across from him. Not apart, but not too close. Last night, it can't be something we just pretend didn't happen. I don't want to pretend, he said, his eyes steady. Do you? No, I whispered, but we crossed a line. One we can't uncross. I think that line was already blurred the moment we started avoiding each other. He said, we've been pretending for too long. I swallowed hard. It's not just about want. Cole, I'm supposed to be someone who takes care of you. He stepped forward, closing the space between us slowly. You did, you do, but last night, that wasn't about you being responsible for me. That was us choosing each other. As two people, not roles. His words hit somewhere deep. Because I'd felt it too. That shift. That moment when every layer of guilt, shame, and fear had slipped away. And we had seen each other, really seen. I'm scared, I admitted, not of you, of what this means. Me too, he said, but I'm not sorry. I blinked at him. Neither am I. He reached for my hand. I didn't pull away. I'm not asking for promises, he said, or explanations, just honesty. From now on. I nodded slowly. Okay, then here's mine. Last night, I didn't feel like someone who was doing something wrong. I felt safe, held. He stepped closer, gently pulling me into his arms. That's all I want to give you, he whispered. That's all I've wanted. I laid my head against his chest, feeling the slow, steady beat of his heart. We didn't have all the answers, but we weren't hiding from the questions anymore. And that was a beginning. The hours after that conversation passed in a kind of quiet suspension. We didn't force anything. We didn't run either. Cole gave me space, physically, emotionally, but I could feel him watching me with that same steady patience he'd shown all along. He didn't demand answers. He waited for truth. And truth came in slow, heavy waves. Later, as the house fell into evening stillness, I found him on the couch, legs stretched out, a book half open on his lap. He wasn't reading, just thinking. His eyes lifted when I stepped into the room. Neither of us said a word. I sat down beside him. Close, closer than I needed to be. My thigh brushed his. My fingers grazed the edge of his hand on the cushion. He turned toward me, like he'd been holding his breath all day. I keep trying to convince myself it's wrong, I said softly, but my body doesn't feel wrong around you. That's the part one don't know how to deal with. Cole's hand reached for mine. His grip wasn't desperate, it was anchoring. Then stop fighting it, he murmured. Just let yourself feel it. We'll figure out the rest. I looked at him, really looked. The curve of his jaw. The soft stubble that hadn't been there a year ago. The man sitting in front of me wasn't someone I had to protect anymore, he was someone I could lean into. I moved first. My lips brushed his, not a kiss. Not yet, just a question waiting to be answered. He answered by pulling me gently into his lap. The kiss that followed was slow, deep, and dangerously honest. There was no rush, no frantic need. It was reverent, two people rediscovering what it meant to be wanted without conditions. His hand slid up my thighs, warm and cautious. Mine found his shoulders, then his chest. Every inch of skin we touched felt like uncharted territory, familiar and utterly new. Are you sure? He whispered into the space between our mouths. I nodded, heart thudding. I've never been more sure of something I shouldn't want. He lifted me carefully, carried me down the hall without a word. In the quiet safety of my bedroom, the rest of our barriers came down, one by one. Clothes, inhibitions, all the whispered doubts fell away as his hands explored me like a map he'd memorized but never dared to trace. And I welcomed it, welcomed him. When we moved together, it wasn't reckless, it was intentional. Every breath, every sound, was a kind of confession, one that didn't need words. Afterward, we stayed tangled in the silence, my cheek against his chest, his fingers stroking slow, thoughtless patterns into my back. I don't know what this makes us, I whispered. He kissed my forehead. Maybe something new, he said, something we get to name ourselves. And in that moment, for the first time in years, I didn't feel lost. I felt chosen. The next morning was soft. Light filtered through the blinds in golden threads, brushing against the sheets tangled around our bodies. I lay still, listening to the rhythm of Cole's breathing beside me. Slow and steady, his arm was draped over my waist, his fingers resting against the dip of my hip like they belonged there. And for a moment, everything felt okay. Not perfect, not without consequence, but real. I turned slowly, careful not to wake him. Watching him sleep was strange and beautiful. His face, so often guarded, was relaxed now, unguarded. Vulnerable, young, and yet not a boy. Never again a boy, not after last night, not after the way he touched me like he knew exactly who I was underneath every scar. I slipped out of bed quietly, wrapping myself in a robe as I padded into the kitchen. The air was crisp, early, still full of questions. I poured coffee, let it warm my hands while my mind spun. The weight of what we'd done hadn't vanished, but it wasn't crushing. It just was, a choice we'd made, a boundary crossed not in impulse, but in hunger, for closeness, for truth, for something neither of us had dared name until now. Footsteps behind me. I didn't have to turn. Cole came up behind me slowly, his hand grazing the small of my back as he passed. His presence settled around me like gravity. Didn't mean to fall asleep like that, he said, voice thick with sleep. You needed it, I replied, handing him a cup. He took it, our fingers brushing. That single contact still sent a ripple through me. We stood there in silence for a while, sipping quietly, the weight between us gentle but undeniable. So, I said eventually, what now? He looked at me, not with panic, not with pressure, but with openness. Whatever you want it to be. I don't know what that is yet, I admitted. That's okay. He leaned back against the counter, watching me the way he always did, like I was more than just a woman. More than a past, like I was something worth discovering. I don't want to make your life harder, he said. I don't want to complicate things for you. I smiled, faint and honest. You already have. A pause. Then, softer. But maybe I needed that. He reached for my hand again. Then let's not pretend. Let's not lie to ourselves or hide from it. Whatever this is, we treat it with honesty. I nodded, lacing my fingers with his. No more pretending. He pulled me closer, pressing a kiss to my forehead. Not lustful, not rushed, just present. In that kitchen, in the morning after, We didn't label what we were. We simply stayed in the moment, together. And for once, that was enough. We didn't talk about it again that day. Not because we were avoiding it, but because something unspoken had settled between us. A kind of truce, a breath, like we both knew the fire was still smoldering under the surface. But neither of us wanted to throw fuel on it too soon. Cole helped me clean up the guest room, his room, technically, and we moved through the motions like we had before everything changed. But even in that, there was something different now. The way his fingers brushed mine when we made the bed. The way I felt the heat of him every time he passed behind me. The way we both hesitated just a second longer in every shared silence. By the afternoon, I'd retreated to the porch. Barefoot, wrapped in a thin sweater. Watching the light shift across the trees. I sipped my second coffee of the day. More for comfort than caffeine. Cole stepped outside behind me. Barefoot too, his shirt clinging to him slightly in the warm air. He didn't ask if he could sit. He just did, close. But not touching, respecting the space I hadn't yet figured out how to define. I keep thinking, he said after a while. His voice low, that I should feel more guilt. I glanced at him. Do you? Yes, he admitted, but not about you, about how it changes everything. That landed hard, because I'd been thinking the same thing. I don't regret it, I said, eyes still on the trees. But I feel like I should. Because of what people would say. He murmured. I nodded, because I was supposed to be something different for you. He looked at me then. Really looked. You were. You still are. But that doesn't mean we can't be something else. Too. I wanted to believe that. But I also knew that life wasn't made of soft mornings and whispered promises. It was made of consequences. I think we need space. I said finally. He nodded slowly, not hurt, just processing. Okay, not because I don't care. I added quickly, but because I care too much. He reached for my hand again. And this time I let him. Whatever happens, he said, you'll never be just a phase to me. I looked at him, heart heavy and warm at once. And you'll never be just a mistake to me. He kissed my hand, gently, reverently, and stood. I'll go stay with a friend for a while. He offered, give us time to think. And just like that, he stepped back, not out of rejection, but out of respect. When he left later that evening, he hugged me like he meant it, pressed his lips to my cheek like we were still holding the story between us, just paused. Not erased. And when the door clicked shut behind him, I stood in the hallway with my hand on my chest, feeling it still beat wildly. Not from fear, but from love I wasn't sure I was ready to carry yet. In today's world, where loneliness often hides behind busy schedules and curated screens, this story reminds us of the importance of emotional honesty. Real connection can't survive in silence. Whether it's with a partner, a friend, or even ourselves, we must have the courage to speak about desire, fear, guilt, and truth. The lines between right and wrong may blur in moments of vulnerability. But clear communication can help us understand what we truly need versus what we're reaching for out of emptiness. So ask the hard questions. Listen without judgment, and never ignore the quiet pull of your own emotional truth.